Chapter 1. The Lights of Gossington Hall. The snow fell softly over St. Mary Mead, as though nature herself wished to wrap the little village in a clean white shawl for Christmas. It was Christmas Eve, and every cottage window glowed with warm lamplight. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts, spiced wine and pine. In the high street, the old church bells had rung for evening service, and now the villagers walked home in small cheerful groups, their boots crunching pleasantly on the fresh snow. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing-room at St. Mary Mead's most charming cottage, her hands moving steadily with her knitting needles. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with delicate glass baubles she had collected over many decades. At 76, Miss Marple appeared the very picture of a gentle, slightly vague old lady. Those who knew her better understood that very little escaped her sharp blue eyes. A letter lay open on the small table beside her. It was written in a bold, flowing hand. "My dear Jane, you simply must come to Gossington Hall this evening. I am giving a proper Christmas Eve party, the first since poor Arthur left us. The house has been too quiet. Do say you will come. There will be carols, good food, and plenty of the old crowd. I won't take no for an answer. Yours affectionately, Geraldine Bantry." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Geraldine Bantry had been a lively woman all her life. But since Colonel Bantry's death 2 years earlier, she had thrown herself into managing the large estate with surprising energy. Gossington Hall had been redecorated, new curtains hung, and now it seemed the widow was determined to fill the old house with light and laughter once more. At 7:30, Miss Marple's faithful friend and helper, Cherry Baker, helped her into a warm woolen coat and wrapped a soft scarf around her neck. "You look ever so nice, Miss Marple," Cherry said warmly. "That deep green suits you. Mind you don't stay too late now. Snow's coming down heavier." "I shall be quite all right, Cherry dear. Mr. Edwards is driving me in his car." The short journey to Gossington Hall took only 10 minutes, yet it felt like stepping into another world. The great house blazed with lights. Every window shone golden against the snowy darkness. A large Christmas tree stood proudly in the entrance hall, visible through the tall windows. Its branches, heavy with shining ornaments and tiny electric candles. Miss Marple was greeted at the door by the butler, Simmons, whose face showed the quiet satisfaction of a man who had served the family for 30 years. "Miss Marple, how very good to see you. Madam is in the drawing-room." The drawing-room was already full of voices and laughter. A tall Christmas tree dominated one corner, glittering with red and gold. Logs burned brightly in the enormous fireplace, and the air smelled of mulled wine, cinnamon, and fresh pine. Geraldine Bantry swept forward to greet her, a handsome woman of 60 with silver hair elegantly arranged, and a deep crimson dress that suited her commanding presence. "Jane, at last. I was beginning to fear the snow had put you off." She kissed Miss Marple's cheek. "Come, let me introduce you to everyone. Though of course you know most of them already." There was Dr. Haydock, looking rather distinguished in his dinner jacket, standing near the fireplace with the vicar, Mr. Prescott, and his plump, good-natured wife. Young Peter Carmody, Mrs. Bantry's nephew, was laughing loudly with a pretty dark-haired girl named Sylvia Reed, who had recently come to stay at the hall as a companion secretary. Major Allington, a retired army man with a bristling moustache, was discussing hunting days with old Miss Weatherby. Several other neighbours and 2 or 3 London visitors completed the party. Miss Marple accepted a glass of mulled wine and settled comfortably into a chair near the fire. She listened with her usual gentle interest as conversations flowed around her. "I must say, Geraldine has done wonders with the old place," remarked Dr. Haydock quietly to her. "Though I wonder if all this entertaining is quite wise. She's not as young as she was." "None of us are, dear doctor," Miss Marple replied with a small smile. "But it is pleasant to see the house full of life again." Dinner was announced at 9 o'clock, a splendid affair of roast goose, chestnut stuffing, rich plum pudding blazing with brandy and trays of crystallized fruits. The talk grew louder and more animated as the wine flowed. Peter Carmody told amusing stories of his time in London, while Sylvia Reed blushed prettily whenever he looked at her. Miss Marple noticed that Geraldine Bantry watched the young couple with a mixture of fondness and something else, perhaps slight concern. After dinner, everyone returned to the drawing room for coffee and liqueurs. The lights were dimmed, and the great tree glowed even more beautifully. At Geraldine's suggestion, they began to sing carols. Miss Marple's clear, sweet soprano joined the others in Silent Night and Hark, the herald angels sing. It was during O Come, All Ye Faithful that Miss Marple first felt a small shiver of unease. She had noticed that Mrs. Bantry had slipped out of the room some minutes earlier. The singing continued. But when the carol ended, there was a noticeable gap where their hostess should have been. "Geraldine," called Major Allington. "Where's our dear hostess got to?" "Probably checking on the presents under the tree," laughed Peter Carmody. "Aunt Geraldine loves a bit of drama on Christmas Eve." Several minutes passed. The atmosphere remained jolly, yet Miss Marple's knitting needles had slowed. He glanced towards the tall double doors that led to the library and the smaller sitting room beyond, where the largest Christmas tree of all stood. "I think," she said quietly, "someone should go and see if Mrs. Bantry is quite all right." Dr. Haydock nodded. "I'll go." He left the room. The guests waited, chatting lightly. Then came a sudden, sharp cry, not loud, but unmistakable in its horror. Miss Marple rose at once. The others followed her across the hall and into the long library. The great Christmas tree stood in all its glory, its lights twinkling merrily. Beneath its lowest branches, lying on the soft Persian rug, was Geraldine Bantry. She lay on her back, her crimson dress spread around her like spilled wine. A silk scarf was twisted tightly around her throat. Her eyes stared upward, fixed and sightless. On her bosom, where the famous Harrington ruby brooch, a great square stone surrounded by diamonds, should have been, there was only an empty place. The pin had been torn away violently. For a moment no one spoke. The only sound was the soft falling of snow against the window panes, and the distant, ironic tinkling of a music box playing "Rest Ye Merry, Gentlemen," from somewhere deeper in the house. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body, then looked up, his face grave. Chapter 2, Death. Beneath the tree, Dr. Haydock rose slowly, his face pale and set in professional gravity. "She's dead," he said quietly, "strangled. And from the look of it, not more than 15 or 20 minutes ago." A wave of horror swept through the room. Sylvia Reed gave a small, choked cry and clutched Peter Carmody's arm. The young man himself stared at his aunt's body with wide, disbelieving eyes. Major Allington's moustache seemed to bristle even more fiercely as he muttered, "Good God! In her own house. On Christmas Eve." Miss Marple stood a little apart from the others, her hands folded over her knitting bag. Her blue eyes moved gently from one face to another, noting everything. The slight trembling of Sylvia's lower lip, the way Peter's hand hovered uncertainly near the girl's waist, the sudden flush that had risen in old Miss Weatherby's cheeks. Simmons, the butler, appeared in the doorway, his usual composure badly shaken. "Madam," he began, then saw the scene and stopped dead. "Simmons," said Dr. Haydock firmly, "please telephone the police at once. Ask for Inspector Slack. Tell him there has been a murder at Gossington Hall." The word murder seemed to echo coldly among the Christmas decorations. The bright lights on the tree suddenly looked garish, almost mocking. Mrs. Prescott, the vicar's wife, began to cry softly. Her husband put an arm around her shoulders, though his own face was as white as the snow outside. "We must not touch anything," Miss Marple said in her mild, apologetic voice. "Not until the police arrive. That is the correct procedure, is it not, Doctor?" "Quite right, Miss Marple," Haydock agreed. He looked at her with the respect of an old friend who knew her methods well. The guests were gently herded back into the main drawing room, though no one had much heart for sitting down. The fire still burned brightly, but the warmth felt distant now. Coffee cups from earlier stood forgotten on the tables. The scent of pine and spices that had seemed so festive only half an hour ago now felt heavy and oppressive. Peter Carmody paced restlessly near the windows. "Who on earth would want to harm Aunt Geraldine?" he burst out. "She was difficult sometimes, but everyone liked her. This must be some outsider, a burglar who got in through the French windows." Major Allington shook his head. "No broken glass. No sign of forced entry that I could see. And why take only the brooch and leave everything else?" "The Harrington ruby," murmured Miss Weatherby in a hushed tone. "Worth a small fortune, I've heard. She always wore it on special occasions." Miss Marple sat quietly in her favourite armchair by the fire, her fingers once more moving mechanically with her knitting. She spoke almost as if to herself. "It is very sad. Mrs. Bantry was so looking forward to this evening. She told me only last week how much she wanted to bring life back to Gossington Hall." Inspector Slack arrived within 25 minutes, accompanied by 2 constables and the police surgeon. He was a brisk, rather irritable man who had never fully appreciated Miss Marple's talents, though he had learned, grudgingly, not to dismiss her entirely. "Another murder in St. Mary Mead," he said dryly as he entered. "I might have known. Right. Everyone stay where you are. I'll speak to you one by one." While the inspector examined the scene in the library with the doctor, Miss Marple observed the guests carefully. She noticed that Sylvia Reed had grown strangely quiet, her pretty face pale and strained. Peter kept glancing at her with a mixture of protectiveness and anxiety. Major Allington was trying to comfort Miss Weatherby, who kept repeating, "Such a dreadful thing," at Christmas time. When Inspector Slack returned to the drawing room, his expression was even grimmer. Mrs. Bantry was strangled with her own silk scarf, the one she was wearing earlier this evening. "The brooch is missing. We'll search the house and grounds at first light. But the snow isn't helping. Now, did anyone leave this room between dinner and the carol singing?" Several people exchanged uneasy glances. Mrs. Bantry had slipped out during the carols, that much was clear. But who else? Peter Carmody admitted he had gone to the smoking room for a cigarette shortly before the singing began. Sylvia Reed said she had gone upstairs to fetch a warmer shawl because she felt cold. Major Allington claimed he had been in the billiard room for only a few minutes. The others insisted they had remained together in the drawing room the entire time. Inspector Slack wrote everything down with obvious dissatisfaction. "So basically, almost any of you could have done it," he said bluntly. A heavy silence fell. Miss Marple spoke gently. "Inspector, perhaps it would be helpful to know more about the ruby brooch. Mrs. Bantry mentioned to me once that it had certain associations." Slack raised an eyebrow. "What sort of associations?" Miss Marple hesitated, then continued in her soft voice. "It originally belonged to her husband's family. There was some talk years ago. Nothing proven, of course, that Colonel Bantry had acquired it under rather irregular circumstances during his time in India. Some people believed it carried bad luck." Peter Carmody gave a short, nervous laugh. "Aunt Geraldine didn't believe in that nonsense. She loved that brooch, wore it constantly after Uncle Arthur died." "Perhaps someone else believed in the bad luck," murmured Miss Marple. The questioning continued late into the night. Statements were taken. The body was finally removed, covered respectfully. By the time the police allowed the guests to leave, it was well past 2 in the morning. The snow had stopped, leaving the world outside strangely silent and white. Miss Marple was among the last to depart. As Dr. Haydock helped her into her coat, he said quietly, "Jane, what do you make of it?" She looked up at him, her eyes troubled. "There is more here than a simple robbery, Dr. Mrs. Bantry was killed by someone she knew, someone who was in this house tonight. The way the scarf was twisted, there was real anger in that act. And the brooch." She paused. "The brooch may not have been taken for its value alone." Haydock frowned. You already have suspicions? Miss Marple gave her sweetest, most innocent smile. Suspicions are dangerous things, dear doctor. One must have facts. But I do wonder, why remove the brooch after the murder? Why not take it and slip away? It almost seems as if the killer wanted us to notice its absence. She stepped out into the cold night air. The Christmas stars shone brightly overhead, but their beauty felt distant and cold. Somewhere in the darkness of St. Mary Mead, a murderer was hiding behind a familiar face, perhaps even now drinking a final glass of brandy or pretending to sleep. As Mr. Edwards drove her home through the silent, snow-covered lanes, Miss Marple leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes. The image of Geraldine Bantry, lying beneath the twinkling Christmas tree, refused to leave her mind. "Poor dear," she whispered to herself. She wanted so much to bring joy back to her house. Instead, she brought death. Miss Marple opened her eyes and gazed out at the white fields. Her expression had changed. The gentle old lady was still there, but beneath it lay something far sharper, a mind already turning over small details, inconsistencies, and the quiet lies people tell when they are afraid. The game, as she had once heard her nephew Raymond describe it, had begun in earnest. Chapter 3. Whispers and Snowflakes. The morning after the murder dawned crisp and painfully bright. Sunlight sparkled on the fresh snow covering St. Mary Mead, turning the village into a picture postcard that felt almost cruel in its beauty. Inside the cottages, however, the usual Christmas cheer had been replaced by shocked murmurs and hastily drawn curtains. Miss Marple had slept little. She rose early, dressed in her warmest grey wool dress, and sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the world outside. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap. Instead, her mind moved carefully over the events of the previous night, like a gardener examining every leaf for signs of blight. Cherry Baker brought in fresh toast and marmalade. "It's all over the village already, Miss Marple. They say Mrs. Bantry was robbed and strangled right under her own Christmas tree. Folk are frightened to go out. Mrs. Ridley at the post office says it must be one of those London types who came for the party." Miss Marple smiled gently. "People do love to speculate, Cherry dear. Often they speculate quite wrongly." At 10 o'clock, Dr. Haydock arrived, stamping snow from his boots. His face looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes. "Thought I'd look in on you, Jane," he said, accepting a cup of tea. "Slack's already up at the hall, turning the place upside down. He's convinced it's a straightforward theft gone wrong, but I'm not so sure." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Doctor, was there anything unusual about the way she was killed?" Haydock rubbed his chin. The scarf was twisted with considerable force. It wasn't a quick, quiet murder. There was passion in it. Anger, perhaps even hatred. The brooch was ripped from her dress rather violently. The pin tore the fabric. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the brooch itself? No sign of it yet. They've searched the entire ground floor. Slack thinks the killer may have thrown it out into the snow to retrieve later, but with the fresh snowfall last night, that would be nearly impossible to find now." They sat in silence for a moment. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked steadily, a reminder that time moved on even when tragedy struck. "I keep thinking of her face," Miss Marple said softly. Geraldine looked surprised, not just frightened, surprised, as though the person who attacked her was the last one she expected. Haydock sighed. She invited quite a mixed group last night. Family, old friends, and a few newer faces. Young Sylvia Reed has only been at the hall for 3 months. Peter Carmody has money troubles. Everyone knows that. Then there's Major Allington. He and Colonel Bantry had some quarrel years ago over money, though they patched it up publicly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled briefly. "Dear Doctor, you are becoming quite the detective yourself." He gave a short laugh. "Blame it on long association with you." Later that morning, Miss Marple decided to visit Gossington Hall. The snow made walking difficult, so she accepted a lift from the vicar's wife, who was taking some food baskets to the staff. The atmosphere at the hall had changed completely. The Christmas tree in the entrance hall still stood, but its lights were switched off. Black crape had been hung on the front door. Simmons, the butler, looked as though he had aged 10 years overnight. "Miss Marple," he said with genuine relief. "The inspector is in the library with Mr. Carmody. Shall I announce you?" "No need, Simmons. I shall wait in the small morning room if I may." As she waited, Miss Marple observed the room carefully. A half-finished letter lay on the writing desk. Geraldine's bold handwriting. It was addressed to her solicitor. Miss Marple did not touch it, but her sharp eyes read what was visible. "And, in light of recent developments, I have decided to make changes to my will." The door opened. Inspector Slack entered, looking harassed. "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd turn up. Come to offer your village wisdom," she smiled sweetly. "Only to offer my condolences and see if there is any way a poor old woman can be of help." Slack grunted, but allowed her to stay. Peter Carmody followed him in, looking pale and unshaven. "I still can't believe it," Peter said, sinking into a chair. Aunt Geraldine was difficult, yes. She could be sharp with money, but she was family. Who would do such a thing? Miss Marple spoke gently. "Mr. Carmody, I noticed last night that you and Miss Reed seemed very close. Was your aunt pleased about that friendship?" Peter flushed. She liked Sylvia well enough as a secretary, but she made it clear she didn't want me distracted from sorting out my business affairs in London. She said Sylvia was too ambitious. "Ambitious," Miss Marple repeated mildly. Peter hesitated. "Sylvia comes from a poor background. Aunt Geraldine sometimes worried she was after the family fortune, but that's ridiculous. Sylvia's a good girl." Inspector Slack made a note. "And your own financial position, Mr. Carmody." Peter shifted uncomfortably. "I owe some money, gambling debts from last year. Aunt Geraldine had promised to help me clear them after Christmas. Now," his voice broke slightly. For the first time, genuine grief showed through the shock. Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy. Young people so often made mistakes, and the world judged them harshly. Sylvia Reed was called in next. The pretty dark-haired girl looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. She twisted a handkerchief between her fingers as she spoke. "Mrs. Bantry was kind to me, truly. She gave me this position when I had nowhere else to go. I would never harm her." "Yet you left the drawing-room during the carols," said Slack bluntly. "I went upstairs for my shawl, that's all. I was only gone 5 or 6 minutes." Miss Marple noticed the girl's hands trembling. "My dear," she said kindly, "grief affects us all differently. If there is anything weighing on your mind, it is always better to speak truthfully. The truth, however painful, brings its own peace." Sylvia looked at her for a long moment, then shook her head. "There is nothing, Miss Marple. Nothing." But Miss Marple was not convinced. Later, as she walked through the garden with Dr. Haydock, the snow crunching beneath their feet, she shared her thoughts. "There are undercurrents here, Doctor. Mrs. Bantry was planning to change her will. Young Peter needs money. Sylvia appears frightened. Major Allington has old resentments. Even dear Miss Weatherby seemed unusually nervous last night." Haydock kicked at a clump of snow. "You think the brooch is a red herring?" "Perhaps not a herring," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "But maybe a symbol. Something that represented old wounds. The Harrington ruby has a history. Geraldine once told me it caused a great scandal in her husband's family many years ago. A young Indian servant was wrongly accused of stealing it. He was sent to prison and later died there. Some people believed the ruby was cursed." "You don't believe in curses, surely?" Miss Marple smiled. "Not in the supernatural sense, no. But evil deeds have a way of casting long shadows. Shadows that can reach even into a bright Christmas party." They stopped near the frozen fountain. In the distance, police constables were still searching the snow-covered grounds. Miss Marple's voice grew quieter. "The killer is someone who knew the house well. Someone who knew exactly when Mrs. Bantry would step away from the party. Someone who hated her enough to look into her eyes while strangling her. That kind of hatred is rarely born overnight, Doctor. It grows slowly like a poisonous plant in a beautiful garden. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and I fear that unless we find the truth, soon this Christmas may claim more than one victim. As they turned back toward the house, Miss Marple glanced up at the windows of Gossington Hall. For a brief second she thought she saw a curtain move on the first floor. Someone was watching them. The snow began to fall again, gently covering the footprints they had left behind. Chapter 4. Folder 4. Threads of the past Miss Marple returned home that afternoon with a quiet determination that belied her frail appearance. The snow continued to fall in soft, persistent flakes, blanketing St. Mary Mead in an eerie silence. Even the usual cheerful greetings between neighbours were subdued, replaced by hurried whispers and suspicious glances toward anyone who had been at Gossington Hall the previous night. She had barely removed her snow-dampened boots when there came a firm knock at the cottage door. Cherry Baker showed in none other than Major Allington, his military bearing slightly wilted by the weight of recent events. Snow clung to his heavy overcoat, and his moustache looked less bristly than usual. "Miss Marple," he began without much preamble, "I hope I'm not intruding. I felt I had to speak with someone who knew Geraldine well. Someone sensible." Miss Marple smiled kindly and gestured toward the armchair by the fire. "Do sit down, Major. Cherry, bring some hot tea, please." The Major looks half frozen. Once settled with a steaming cup in his large hands, Major Allington stared into the flames. "Damnable business," he muttered. Geraldine was a fine woman, opinionated, yes, but loyal. We had our differences over the years, but I respected her. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Differences, Major?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Old history, mostly. Her husband Arthur and I served together in India. It was a matter concerning some regimental funds. Nothing proven, you understand, but feelings ran high. Geraldine always believed I held a grudge. Truth is, I did for a while, but that was 25 years ago." "And the ruby brooch?" Miss Marple asked gently. The Major's face darkened. "That infernal stone. Arthur won it in a game of cards from a disgraced Maharaja's agent. There were rumours it was stolen property. An innocent servant took the blame and died in prison. Geraldine knew the story, but wore the thing like a trophy. Almost as if she dared the past to touch her." Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, letting the Major's words settle. "Did you see Mrs. Bantry leave the drawing-room last night?" "I did," he admitted. "She said something about checking the presents under the big tree in the library. Seemed perfectly normal. I went to the billiard room for a quick smoke. When I returned, everyone was singing. Then, well, you know the rest." He set his cup down with a slight clatter. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Marple. I'm not a rich man. My pension is modest. Geraldine once offered to lend me money years ago. I refused. Too proud. Now the police will dig all that up and make it look suspicious." There was real anxiety in his voice. Not just fear of scandal, but a deeper regret. Miss Marple saw in him the loneliness of an old soldier whose battles had long since moved from the battlefield to the quiet corners of memory. After the Major left, Miss Marple had a light lunch, and then decided on a short walk to the vicarage. The fresh air helped her think. As she made her way carefully along the cleared path, she met Mrs. Prescott, the vicar's wife, who was returning from delivering Christmas charity baskets. "Oh, Jane, what a terrible tragedy!" Mrs. Prescott's round face was blotchy from crying. Poor Geraldine. She could be imperious, but she always supported the church funds generously. Who could have done such a wicked thing? "That," said Miss Marple, "is precisely what we must discover. At the vicarage, over tea and mince pies that no one had much appetite for, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. The vicar mentioned that Mrs. Bantry had visited him privately 2 weeks earlier, troubled about family matters. She spoke of making changes, Mr. Prescott said carefully. She felt Peter was drifting and needed firmer guidance. She also expressed some doubts about Sylvia Reed's background. Apparently the girl had told her a rather dramatic story about her parents' death. But Geraldine had begun to question certain details. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Did she intend to alter her will significantly? The vicar hesitated, bound by confidentiality, but his silence spoke volumes. By late afternoon, Miss Marple found herself once again at Gossington Hall. Inspector Slack was in a foul mood, pacing the library where the murder had occurred. The Christmas tree had been stripped of its lower decorations, and chalk marks on the carpet showed where Geraldine Bantry's body had lain. "Still no sign of the ruby," Slack grumbled. "We've searched every inch. If it was thrown outside, the snow has buried it good and proper. I've got men digging through drifts like fools." "Perhaps the brooch was never meant to be found," Miss Marple suggested mildly. Slack stared at her. Meaning, Inspector, that the theft may have been secondary, a distraction, or perhaps a message. Peter Carmody entered the room then, looking more composed than earlier. Behind him came Sylvia Reed, who stayed close to his side. The affection between them was obvious, yet so was the strain. Sylvia's eyes darted nervously whenever anyone spoke. "Aunt Geraldine's solicitor arrived an hour ago," Peter announced. "She made a new will only 10 days ago. Most of the estate goes to me, but with strict conditions. I must prove financial responsibility for 5 years. There are generous bequests to the servants and the church, and a rather large sum for you, Sylvia, provided you remain in a respectable position for 2 more years. Sylvia looked genuinely shocked. "For me? But why? She barely trusted me." "Apparently she had grown fond of you," Peter said quietly, despite her suspicions. Miss Marple watched the young woman carefully. There were tears in Sylvia's eyes, but also something else. Fear mixed with relief. The human heart was a complicated thing, Miss Marple reflected. Grief and self-preservation often walked hand in hand. As evening approached, Miss Marple requested to see Mrs. Bantry's private sitting room. With Slack's reluctant permission, she spent 20 quiet minutes there, observing the small details that spoke volumes. A half-written letter expressing disappointment in Peter's latest investment, failure. A photograph of Colonel Bantry wearing the ruby brooch on his uniform, and tucked beneath a blotting pad, a newspaper cutting from 3 months earlier, about a young woman convicted of fraud in London, a girl who bore a striking resemblance to Sylvia Reed. Miss Marple's expression remained gentle, but her mind worked rapidly. So many threads: old colonial sins, youthful indiscretions, financial desperation, and perhaps a carefully constructed new identity. When she finally left the hall as darkness fell, Dr. Haydock walked her to the waiting car. "Any conclusions yet, Jane?" he asked. "Only that human nature is sadly predictable in its weaknesses," she replied. "We all carry our little secrets, Doctor, but some secrets are dangerous enough to kill for." She paused before stepping into the car and looked back at the great house, its windows glowing with electric light that no longer seemed welcoming. Geraldine Bantry died because she decided to face the past instead of ignoring it. That decision cost her life. The question now is, whose past was she about to expose? The snow fell thicker as the car pulled away. In the library window, a silhouette stood watching them depart. Miss Marple could not tell who it was, but she felt certain the murderer was still inside Gossington Hall, wrapped in the remnants of Christmas cheer, waiting and watching. And somewhere in the frozen garden, the Harrington ruby lay hidden, a blood-red secret beneath the pure white snow. Chapter 5. The Weight of Old Sins. The coroner's inquest was held 2 days later in the village hall of St. Mary Mead. Christmas had come and gone in a subdued hush. Many cottages still displayed their trees and lights, but the usual merrymaking had faded into uneasy quiet. Children played in the snow with less laughter, and mothers called them indoors earlier than usual. Miss Marple arrived early, dressed in her best black coat and a hat with a small veil. She took a seat near the back, where she could observe everyone without drawing attention. The room filled slowly. Peter Carmody sat with Sylvia Reed, their hands clasped tightly. Major Allington occupied a chair by the wall, staring straight ahead. Dr. Haydock and the Prescotts were present, along with most of the party guests, and a large number of villagers hungry for details. Inspector Slack gave evidence first, his voice clipped and professional. He described the scene, the missing ruby brooch, and the medical conclusion that death had been caused by strangulation. The silk scarf had belonged to the deceased. No fingerprints of value had been found. The killer had worn gloves. When Miss Marple was called, a faint ripple of interest passed through the room. She gave her testimony in a soft, almost apologetic voice. "I had known Mrs. Bantry for many years," she said. She was a generous woman, though perhaps sometimes too forthright in her opinions. On the night of the party, she seemed in good spirits. I noticed nothing unusual until she left the room during the carols. When we found her, it was a great shock. The coroner leaned forward. "Did you form any impression, Miss Marple, that Mrs. Bantry feared for her safety?" Miss Marple hesitated only a moment. "Not fear exactly, sir, but I did sense she was preoccupied, as though she had made up her mind about something important." Peter Carmody was questioned at length about his financial troubles. He answered honestly, though his face burned with embarrassment. Yes, he had debts. Yes, his aunt had promised help. No, he had not argued with her that evening. Sylvia Reed's testimony was given in a quiet, trembling voice. She repeated that she had gone upstairs for her shawl. When asked about her relationship with Mrs. Bantry, she said, "She was strict but fair. I respected her." Major Allington spoke of his old friendship with Colonel Bantry and denied any lingering resentment. His voice was steady. But Miss Marple noticed how tightly his hands gripped the edge of the table. The verdict, as expected, was murder by a person or persons unknown. No one was surprised. Yet the formal pronouncement cast a deeper pall over the gathering. After the inquest, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to tea at the vicarage. Mrs. Prescott fussed over her, pressing fresh scones and jam upon her. "Such a dreadful thing to happen at Christmas," the vicar's wife said for the 10th time. "The poor woman, and to think the killer may still be among us." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "That is what worries me most, my dear. The murderer is not some stranger from London. He or she belongs here. Someone who knew the house, knew Geraldine's habits, and knew exactly when to strike." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Miss Weatherby, the elderly spinster who had attended the party. Miss Weatherby lived in a small, overcrowded cottage filled with china ornaments and faded photographs. The old lady was clearly nervous. She offered seed cake with shaking hands. "I hardly slept that night," she confessed. "Every time I closed my eyes, I saw poor Geraldine lying there under that tree, the light still twinkling. It was grotesque." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "You and Mrs. Bantry were friends for a long time." "Friends of a sort," Miss Weatherby said carefully. "We had known each other since we were girls. Geraldine was always the bolder one. She married well. I never did." A trace of bitterness crept into her voice. "She could be thoughtless sometimes. She once made a joke about my spinster's life in front of guests. It hurt more than she realized." Miss Marple's blue eyes were gentle. "People often speak without thinking, but you were at the party the whole time, were you not?" Miss Weatherby hesitated a fraction too long. "Yes. Well, except for a few minutes when I went to powder my nose. The powder room is near the library, you know." A small silence fell. Miss Marple noticed an old photograph on the mantelpiece. A much younger Geraldine Bantry, and a group of friends, including a youthful Miss Weatherby. Colonel Bantry stood behind them, the ruby brooch visible on his lapel. That evening, Dr. Haydock visited Miss Marple again. He looked troubled. "Slack is pressing young Peter hard," he said. "The new will gives the boy a strong motive. And Sylvia, there's something odd about her references. I understand Geraldine had started making inquiries." Miss Marple laid down her knitting. "I found a newspaper cutting in Geraldine's sitting room. It concerned a young woman named Elsie Thompson. convicted of obtaining money by false pretenses. The photograph bore a remarkable resemblance to Sylvia Reed. Haydock whistled softly. Blackmail, possibly, or simply a girl trying to escape her past and build a better life. Geraldine may have confronted her that night. The doctor leaned forward. "Jane, this is becoming dangerous. If the murderer realizes how much you know—" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I am only a silly old woman who notices things. Who would trouble themselves about me?" But even as she spoke the words, she felt a small prickle of unease. Later, after Dr. Haydock had gone, Miss Marple sat alone by her fire. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the occasional soft thud of snow sliding from the roof. She thought of the silk scarf twisted around Geraldine's throat. A woman's scarf, a crime of sudden passion rather than careful planning. The missing ruby, taken either as a trophy or to mislead, the new will, the old colonial scandal, the possible false identity of Sylvia Reed, Major Allington's pride, Miss Weatherby's long-held resentments, Peter's debts. So many human weaknesses, so many motives. She picked up her knitting once more, the needles clicking rhythmically. "One must always look at the pattern," she murmured to herself. "Not just the bright colours, but the dark threads running underneath." Outside, the church bells began to ring for evening service. A beautiful, mournful sound across the snow-covered village. Miss Marple closed her eyes and listened. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone else was listening to those same bells. Someone whose hands still remembered the feeling of silk tightening. Someone who was perhaps even now planning how to protect their secret. Miss Marple opened her eyes. Her expression was no longer gentle. "Whatever you have done," she whispered into the quiet room, "I shall find you, before you harm anyone else." The fire crackled. The snow continued to fall, and in Gossington Hall, the great Christmas tree still stood in the library, its lights now dark, keeping silent watch over the place where murder had struck. Chapter 6. A Face in the Mirror. The days following the inquest passed with a deceptive calm. The snow continued to cloak St. Mary Mead, muffling sounds and slowing life to a gentle crawl, yet beneath the surface anxiety simmered. Villagers locked their doors earlier, and even the most sociable neighbours spoke in lowered voices when they met at the post office or the Blue Boar. Miss Marple spent the morning quietly at home, but her mind was far from idle. She had asked Cherry to bring her the old photograph albums from the cupboard under the stairs. Turning the heavy pages, she studied pictures of younger days. Garden parties at Gossington Hall, tennis matches, and summer fêtes where Geraldine Bantry had always been the centre of attention. One photograph in particular held her gaze. It showed Geraldine and a group of friends on the lawn in 1952. Among them stood a slim, dark-haired girl who bore a striking resemblance to Sylvia Reed. The name written beneath in faded ink was Elsie Thompson, visiting from London. "Elsie Thompson," Miss Marple murmured. The same name as the newspaper cutting she had seen at the hall. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Cherry showed in Sylvia Reed herself, looking pale and fragile in a dark grey coat, her hands clutching a small handbag. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple," Sylvia said, her voice unsteady. "I needed to speak with someone who isn't the police, and isn't Peter." Miss Marple welcomed her warmly, settling the young woman by the fire with a cup of strong tea and a slice of cherry cake. For several minutes, Sylvia said nothing, simply staring into the flames. "You knew, didn't you?" she said at last. "About my real name." Miss Marple nodded gently. "I suspected, my dear, the newspaper cutting, and a very old photograph. But knowing and understanding are two different things. Would you like to tell me the truth?" Sylvia's eyes filled with tears. "My name is Elsie Thompson. I was convicted 3 years ago, foolishly helping a man I loved forge cheques. I served 6 months. When I came out, I wanted a completely new life. I changed my name, created references, and applied for the position with Mrs. Bantry. She was kind at first. Then she started asking questions. 2 weeks ago she confronted me. She had found out everything. "What happened during that confrontation?" Miss Marple asked softly. "She said she would give me a chance to prove myself. She wouldn't dismiss me immediately, but she was changing her will. She planned to leave me a small legacy only if I remained honest for the next 2 years. I was grateful, truly, but that night, during the party, she asked me to meet her briefly in the library. She wanted to talk again about my past. I told her I couldn't come right away because I needed my shawl. When I went upstairs, I was shaking. I was gone longer than I said, perhaps 10 minutes." Sylvia's voice broke. "When I came down, everyone was still singing. I never saw her alive again. I swear it, Miss Marple. I didn't kill her. I had no reason to. She was giving me a chance." Miss Marple studied the girl's face. There was real fear there, and genuine grief, but also the desperate calculation of someone who had already lost much in life. "My dear, the truth has a way of protecting the innocent better than any lie," Miss Marple said kindly. "Is there anything else you haven't told the police?" Sylvia hesitated, then reached into her handbag. She drew out a small envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with words cut from newspapers. "Leave St. Mary Mead or you will be next." "It was pushed under my door this morning," Sylvia whispered. "Peter doesn't know. I'm terrified." Miss Marple examined the note carefully. The letters were crudely arranged, a classic anonymous threat, yet something about the paper felt familiar. Thick, cream-coloured, the sort used for private correspondence at Gossington Hall. "Keep this safe," she advised, "and stay close to Peter for now. But be careful, my dear. Fear can make people do dangerous things." After Sylvia left, Miss Marple sat thinking for a long time. The threat suggested the murderer was still active and nervous. It also suggested that Sylvia knew, or might reveal, something dangerous. That afternoon, Miss Marple wrapped herself warmly and walked slowly toward Gossington Hall. The exercise helped clear her thoughts. As she approached the gates, she met Major Allington coming the other way. He looked startled to see her. "Miss Marple? Out in this weather? You're braver than I am." They walked together for a short distance. The Major seemed unusually talkative. "I've been thinking about that ruby," he said. "Arthur always said it brought trouble. Perhaps Geraldine's death was some sort of justice for the past. That poor servant who died in prison. His family swore revenge one day." "After so many years?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Blood feuds don't always die quickly," the Major replied grimly. At the hall, Inspector Slack was in a better mood than usual. A constable had found something interesting during a second search of the grounds. A single diamond earring belonging to Mrs. Bantry, lying near the edge of the frozen fountain. The matching piece was still on her body when she was found. It appeared to have been dropped in haste. "Suggests the killer left by the side door and crossed the terrace," Slack said with satisfaction. "We're draining part of the fountain tomorrow. The ruby might be in there." Miss Marple said nothing, but she doubted it. The placement felt too convenient. She asked permission to sit once more in Mrs. Bantry's private sitting room. There, in the quiet afternoon light, she noticed something she had missed before. On the writing desk was a small silver mirror, slightly tilted. When she looked into it from the chair where Geraldine often sat, it perfectly reflected the doorway to the library. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Had Geraldine seen her killer approaching in this very mirror? She was still pondering this when Peter Carmody entered the room, looking exhausted. "Miss Marple, I don't know what to do. Sylvia's terrified. The police keep questioning me about money, and now the servants are whispering that one of us must be guilty. The house feels cursed." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his arm. "Grief and fear cloud the mind, my dear boy. Tell me, did your aunt ever mention anyone from her past who might have wished her harm? Anyone connected to India or the ruby?" Peter frowned. "Only once. She said an old woman had written to her last month, the sister of the servant who was wrongly accused. The woman was dying and wanted Geraldine to know the truth before she passed. Aunt Geraldine burned the letter. She said the past was better left buried." Miss Marple felt a small thrill of understanding. Another thread in the pattern. As she left the hall that evening, the sun was setting behind the snowy trees, casting long blue shadows across the lawn. She paused near the spot where the earring had been found. The ground was trampled, but something caught her eye. A tiny scrap of dark green wool caught on a rose bush. She picked it up carefully. It matched the colour of the dress she herself had worn on the night of the murder. Someone had been watching her movements. Miss Marple slipped the scrap into a handbag, her expression calm, but her mind racing. The killer was not only protecting old secrets, they were now actively trying to confuse and frighten those who came too close. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, she felt eyes upon her once again. This time she did not turn around. The game had grown darker, and Miss Marple knew that Christmas in St. Mary Mead was far from over. Chapter 7. The Letter from the Past. The following morning brought a sharp frost that made every branch and blade of grass glitter like crystal. Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the village stir uneasily into life. The postman moved more quickly than usual, and even the milkman's cheerful whistle was absent. Murder had cast a long shadow over St. Mary Mead, and it showed no sign of lifting. Cherry Baker entered with the breakfast tray and the morning post. Among the usual letters was a thick cream-coloured envelope, addressed in an unfamiliar, spidery hand. The postmark was local. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small, faded photograph. The letter read, "Dear Miss Marple, you were always the one who noticed things others missed. Geraldine Bantry paid for the sins of her husband. The ruby was never hers to wear with pride. If you wish to know the truth, come to the old summer house in Gossington Grounds at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Come alone. The past has waited long enough." No signature followed. Miss Marple studied the photograph. It showed a young Indian man in servant's uniform standing beside Colonel Bantry. On the back, written in the same spidery hand, "Ramesh Singh, innocent man who died for a rich man's crime." She sat very still for several minutes, her tea growing cold. The letter could be a trap. It could also be the breakthrough she had been waiting for. After careful thought, she slipped both letter and photograph into her handbag and went about her morning as though nothing unusual had occurred. At luncheon, Dr. Haydock called in unexpectedly. He looked concerned when she showed him the anonymous letter. "This is madness, Jane. You can't possibly go alone. It's clearly from the murderer, or someone shielding them, or someone who is genuinely afraid and wants the truth known," Miss Marple countered gently. "The handwriting is educated but shaky, perhaps an elderly person. And the summer house has always been a place for private conversations at Gossington. Geraldine used to meet her friends there years ago." Haydock shook his head. "I still don't like it. I'll follow at a distance." "No, dear doctor. If the writer sees anyone else, they may not appear. I shall be quite safe. After all, it is broad daylight." At 10 minutes to 3, Miss Marple set off toward Gossington Hall, wrapped in her warmest coat and carrying her sturdiest umbrella. The snow on the private path had been partially cleared, but her boots still crunched loudly in the silence. The great house loomed ahead, its windows dark and watchful. The old summer house stood at the far end of the rose garden, half hidden by snow-laden bushes. Its once white paint was peeling, and the door creaked when Miss Marple pushed it open. Inside it smelled of damp wood and forgotten summers. A single bench ran along one wall. She was not alone. An elderly woman rose slowly from the shadows. She was small and stooped, with silver hair pulled back tightly and dark, intelligent eyes. Her coat was old but well kept. "Miss Marple," she said in a voice that still carried a faint Indian accent, "I am Priya Singh. Ramesh Singh was my elder brother." Miss Marple sat down opposite her without hesitation. "I am sorry for your loss, Mrs. Singh, even after so many years." The old woman's eyes filled with quiet pain. "My brother was 24 when Colonel Bantry accused him of stealing the Harrington ruby. He was innocent. The real thief was one of the Colonel's own officers, Major Allington's cousin, in fact. But the Colonel protected his friend. My brother was beaten, imprisoned, and died of fever within a year. My family was destroyed. Miss Marple nodded. And you wrote to Mrs. Bantry recently? Yes, I am dying, Miss Marple. Cancer. I wanted her to know the truth before I left this world. I asked only that she acknowledge my brother's innocence publicly and return the ruby to my family. She refused. She said the past should remain buried. 2 days later, she was dead. Did you kill her? Miss Marple asked with surprising directness. Priya Singh gave a tired smile. I am 78 years old and can barely walk without pain. I did not kill her. But I am not sorry she is dead. The ruby carries blood. It always has. Miss Marple studied the woman carefully. There was deep sorrow in her, but no guilt. Then why ask me here today? Because you are known to be fair, and because I saw something on the night of the party. I was not invited, of course, but I came anyway. I stood in the garden, watching the lights and the people through the windows. I wanted to speak to Mrs. Bantry one last time. What did you see, Mrs. Singh? The old woman leaned forward. I saw a woman in a dark dress leave the drawing room and enter the library. Not long after, another figure, I could not see the face clearly, followed her. Then came the sound of raised voices, very brief. After that, silence. Later, when the screaming started, I slipped away. Can you describe the second figure at all? Tall, perhaps a man's height, but I cannot be sure. The lights from the tree made strange shadows. Miss Marple sat thinking. Did you see anyone else? Only one more thing. As I was leaving through the side gate, I saw Miss Reed, or whatever her real name is, standing at an upstairs window. She looked terrified. The two women spoke for nearly 20 minutes more. Priya Singh told stories of her brother's kindness, of letters he had written from prison protesting his innocence, and of the long, quiet anger her family had carried across decades and continents. Miss Marple listened with genuine compassion. Human suffering, in her experience, was rarely simple. As they parted, Priya Singh pressed something small into Miss Marple's gloved hand. It was a cheap metal button, the kind found on men's overcoats. I found this near the summer-house path this morning. It may mean nothing, or everything. Miss Marple returned home as dusk was falling, her mind full of new threads. She found Dr. Haydock waiting anxiously in her drawing room. "Thank God you're back," he said gruffly. "Well?" Miss Marple told him everything. When she showed him the button, he frowned. "That looks like one from Major Allington's old military greatcoat. He's worn it for years." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "or perhaps someone wanted it to look that way." Before the doctor could reply, the telephone rang. Cherry answered it, then called Miss Marple with a worried face. "It's Mr. Carmody, miss. He sounds very upset." Peter's voice was breathless. "Miss Marple, thank goodness. Sylvia has disappeared. She left a note saying she couldn't bear the suspicion anymore and was going away. But her clothes are still here. I'm afraid something has happened to her." Miss Marple's grip tightened on the receiver. "Stay at the hall, Peter. Lock the doors if necessary. I shall come at once." She turned to Dr. Haydock, her face grave. "It seems our murderer is growing desperate. Another life may be in danger tonight." Outside, fresh snow began to fall once more, covering the footprints that led to and from the old summer house. In the gathering darkness, Gossington Hall waited, its lights burning brightly while secrets moved silently through its corridors, and somewhere in the frozen night, a frightened young woman, or a clever killer, was playing the final moves of a deadly game. Chapter 8. The vanishing Secretary Knight had fallen swiftly over Gossington Hall, bringing with it a biting wind that drove the fresh snow almost horizontally across the lawns. The great house, which had once glowed with Christmas warmth, now stood like a beacon of anxiety. Every window was lit, and servants moved nervously through the corridors, whispering among themselves. Miss Marple arrived with Dr. Haydock, both of them stamping snow from their boots in the entrance hall. Peter Carmody met them at once, his face drawn, and his usual boyish charm completely gone. "She's gone," he said hoarsely. "Sylvia left this note on my dressing table." He handed Miss Marple a crumpled piece of paper. "Peter, darling, I can't stay here any longer. The suspicion is killing me. I need time to think. Please don't look for me. I'll be safe." With love, Sylvia Miss Marple examined the note carefully under the bright hall light. The handwriting was Sylvia's, or at least very like it. But the pressure on the pen was uneven, and the final words sloped downward sharply, a sign of great emotional distress. "She took nothing but her handbag and the coat she was wearing," Peter continued. "Her clothes, her suitcase. Everything is still in her room. That doesn't sound like someone planning to disappear, does it?" "No, my dear," Miss Marple said quietly. "It does not." Inspector Slack had already been summoned and was in a foul temper. First a murder, now a missing girl. This village is becoming a madhouse. We've got men searching the grounds and the roads leading out of the village. If she's wandered off in this snow, she won't last long. Miss Marple asked to see Sylvia's bedroom. The room was neat and feminine, with a few personal touches, a small vase of dried flowers, a novel open on the bedside table, and a silver hairbrush engraved with Sylvia's initials. The wardrobe doors stood open, revealing rows of simple but good quality dresses. A small jewellery box lay open on the dressing table. Inside were modest pieces, nothing valuable. "Nothing appears to be missing except what she might have been wearing," Miss Marple observed. "Look here, Doctor." She pointed to a faint smear of powder on the edge of the dressing table and a single dark hair caught in the hairbrush. Haydock frowned. "She left in a hurry." "Or was taken in a hurry," Miss Marple murmured. They returned downstairs where Inspector Slack was questioning the servants. Simmons, the butler, reported that he had seen Sylvia going toward the side door around 5:30, shortly after Miss Marple had left the premises. She had seemed upset, but not frightened. Major Allington arrived shortly afterwards, having heard the news in the village. His face was flushed from the cold, and snow clung to his heavy military coat. "Terrible business," he boomed. "First Geraldine, now the girl. I told you that Ruby was cursed. Mark my words. This won't end until it's found and returned to its rightful owners, or destroyed." Miss Marple noticed that one of the buttons on his overcoat was missing. The thread hung loose where it had been torn away. She said nothing, but her eyes missed nothing, while the men discussed search strategies. Miss Marple slipped away to the library where the murder had taken place. The Christmas tree had finally been removed, leaving the room strangely bare and echoing. Only the chalk outline on the carpet remained as a grim reminder. She stood exactly where Geraldine Bantry's body had lain and looked toward the tall mirror on the opposite wall. From there, one could see the reflection of both entrances to the room. Geraldine would have seen her killer approaching. A faint sound made Miss Marple turn. Miss Weatherby stood in the doorway, looking small and frightened in her heavy tweed coat. "I came as soon as I heard about Sylvia," she said. "Such a sweet girl. I hope she's all right." Her hands twisted together nervously. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you privately? There is something I should have told the police days ago." The two women moved to the small morning room. Miss Weatherby sat on the edge of a chair, her face pale. "On the night of the party," she began in a whisper, "I did leave the drawing room for a few minutes, but not only to powder my nose. I followed Geraldine. I had overheard her telling Sylvia that she knew everything about her past. I was afraid Geraldine was going to expose the girl publicly. I've always been rather fond of Sylvia, you see." Miss Marple remained silent, encouraging her to continue. "I reached the library door and heard them arguing. Geraldine said she would not be blackmailed. Not in her own house. Sylvia was crying, denying everything. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I was frightened and hid behind the curtains in the alcove. Someone else entered the library. There was a short, angry exchange. I couldn't make out the words, and then a terrible silence. When I dared to look again, Geraldine was on the floor, and the other person was bending over her, pulling at the brooch. "Who was it?" Miss Marple asked sharply. Miss Weatherby shook her head, tears filling her eyes. I don't know. The lights from the tree were behind them. All I saw was a tall figure in dark clothes. It could have been a man or a woman. I was too terrified to move. I slipped away and rejoined the others just before the carols ended. Miss Marple reached out and patted the old lady's hand. You have done the right thing in telling me, though you should have spoken sooner. Fear makes cowards of us all. At that moment, a shout came from outside. 2 constables had found something near the side gate, Sylvia's handbag lying open in the snow. Inside were her purse, a handkerchief, and a small bottle of smelling salts. No money was missing, but a torn piece of notepaper was clutched in one of the inner pockets. The note read, "Meet me at the old summer house at 6. I know who killed her. Come alone." A friend, Miss Marple's expression grew grave. "The same summer house where I met Mrs. Singh this afternoon," she said quietly to Dr. Haydock. "Someone is playing a very dangerous game indeed." Peter Carmody was nearly beside himself. "We must search the summer house at once." Inspector Slack organised a proper search party. Miss Marple insisted on accompanying them, despite the doctor's protests. The summer house, when they reached it, was empty. But on the bench lay a single green woolen glove, one of Sylvia's. "She was here," Peter whispered. "Or someone wanted us to think she was," Miss Marple replied. As the men continued searching the grounds with lanterns, Miss Marple stood quietly in the summer house, turning the glove over in her hands. Inside the cuff was a small, folded paper. Written in the same spidery hand as the earlier anonymous letter were the words, "The ruby is not lost. It has returned home. The guilty will pay." Miss Marple slipped the paper into her handbag, her mind working with cold clarity. The pattern was becoming clearer now. Old sins, new deceptions, and a killer who was both clever and increasingly desperate. As they walked back toward the house through the swirling snow, "Doctor," Haydock said quietly, "Jane, this has gone far enough. Sylvia may already be dead." Miss Marple's voice was soft but steady. "I do not think so, Doctor, not yet. The murderer still has use for her. She is the perfect scapegoat. A girl with a criminal past. If she disappears permanently, the case may well be closed with her blamed for Geraldine's murder." She paused and looked back at the dark summer house. "But the killer has made one serious mistake. They have underestimated how much a silly old woman notices when people are not quite what they seem." Somewhere in the night, a church bell tolled 9 times. Its sound was muffled by snow, yet it carried across the village like a warning, and in Gossington Hall the lights continued to burn while fear tightened its grip on everyone who had been present on that fatal Christmas Eve. Chapter 9. Shadows in the Snow. The search for Sylvia Reed continued through the night, and into the early hours of the morning. Lanterns moved like fireflies across the white expanse of Gossington grounds, while police constables and volunteers from the village called her name into the bitter wind. By dawn, exhaustion had settled heavily over everyone, yet no trace of the missing girl had been found beyond the glove and handbag. Miss Marple had refused to go home despite Dr. Haydock's strong protests. She sat now in the morning room at Gossington Hall, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, drinking hot cocoa that Simmons had thoughtfully prepared. Her eyes, however, remained alert and thoughtful. Peter Carmody paced the room like a caged animal. "It's been nearly 12 hours. She could be lying somewheres in a snowdrift, injured or worse. This is my fault. I should have protected her better." "Self-reproach is rarely helpful at such times, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "We must focus on what we know rather than what we fear." Inspector Slack entered, brushing snow from his coat. His face was drawn and his usual brusqueness had softened into weary determination. "We've searched every outbuilding and followed the roads for 2 miles in each direction. No footprints leading away from the summer house that we can rely on. The fresh snow has covered most traces. It's as if the girl vanished into thin air." "Or was taken away by car," Miss Marple suggested. "The side lane near the east gate is accessible even in snow if one drives carefully." Slack nodded reluctantly. We're checking that possibility. Meanwhile, I've had reports from London about Elsie Thompson. That's Sylvia's real name. Her conviction was minor, but she was clever. Some say she got off lightly. Peter winced at the words but said nothing. Miss Marple set down her cup. Inspector, I wonder if you have searched Mrs. Bantry's safe, the one behind the portrait in the study. Slack raised an eyebrow. How did you know about that? Geraldine mentioned it once years ago. She kept important papers there, and occasionally jewellery when she did not wish to wear it. They moved to the study at once. After some difficulty, the inspector located the hidden safe. Inside were bundles of documents, several pieces of lesser jewellery, and a long envelope marked Last Will and Testament, revised. But it was the smaller item at the back that caught everyone's attention, a small velvet box. Inside lay a single magnificent ruby earring, the companion to the one found near the fountain, the matching piece to the famous Harrington ruby. Peter stared in disbelief. But that means the brooch was deliberately broken apart, Miss Marple said quietly. The killer did not take the entire piece for its monetary value alone. They wanted the central stone. The rest was left to confuse us. A heavy silence filled the room. Dr. Haydock, who had joined them, spoke first. This changes everything. The murder was planned, not impulsive. Miss Marple's needles, which she had brought with her, clicked softly. Not entirely planned, Doctor. The use of the scarf suggests a moment of sudden rage, but the removal and separation of the ruby shows cold calculation afterwards. Later that morning, Miss Marple requested a private word with Miss Weatherby, who had remained at the hall, offering what help she could. The two elderly ladies sat in the small conservatory, surrounded by frost-covered glass. You saw more than you told me yesterday, didn't you? Miss Marple said, kindly but firmly. Miss Weatherby's hands trembled. I'm frightened, Jane. I've lived in St. Mary Mead all my life. I never imagined. Fear is natural, but silence may cost another life. The older woman took a deep breath. When I was hiding behind the curtain, I heard the killer speak. Just 2 words. You promised. It was a woman's voice, low, but definitely a woman. Then there was a struggle, very brief. Geraldine was strong, you know. After she fell, the person took the brooch, and I think they tried to remove something from her hand as well. A ring, perhaps. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A ring? Yes. Geraldine always wore a small opal ring on her right hand. It wasn't on her body when she was found. I noticed later. This was new information. Miss Marple stored it away carefully. As the day wore on, more pieces began to surface. A local farmer reported seeing a car driving slowly along the East Lane around 6:15 on the evening Sylvia disappeared. The car had no lights, and he could not identify the make or driver. Major Allington arrived at the hall in the afternoon, looking shaken. He asked to speak with Miss Marple privately. I've been a fool, he admitted bluntly. That button you found, it's mine. I lost it weeks ago, but someone must have kept it. I was in the garden that night, Miss Marple, not inside the house when the murder happened. I went out for air and to clear my head. I saw Priya Singh leaving through the side gate. I thought nothing of it at the time. Miss Marple studied his face. And did you see Sylvia? No, but I did see someone else. A figure in a dark coat hurrying from the direction of the summer house toward the village path. I thought it was Peter at first, but the height was wrong, more like a woman's height. The pattern was becoming clearer, yet still frustratingly incomplete. That evening, as Miss Marple prepared to return home for a few hours' rest, Simmons approached her with a small package. This was delivered for you, madam. A boy brought it from the village. He said an old lady paid him 6pence to deliver it. Inside the plain brown paper was the missing opal ring that had belonged to Geraldine Bantry. Wrapped around it was a note in the now familiar spidery handwriting. She wore this while lying. The innocent should not suffer for the guilty. The end is near. Miss Marple's expression grew grave. The killer was communicating directly with her now, a dangerous development. Dr. Haydock insisted on driving her home. As they travelled through the snow-covered lanes, he said quietly, "Jane, you're getting too close. This person has already killed once and possibly taken Sylvia. They won't hesitate to harm you." Miss Marple looked out at the white landscape. "That is precisely why we must finish this soon, Doctor. The murderer is unraveling. The notes, the deliberate clues, the separation of the ruby. These are the actions of someone trying to justify their crime, even while committing more evil. They want absolution as much as they want safety." When they reached her cottage, Miss Marple paused at the gate. "Tomorrow, I think, we shall have the final piece. Tell Inspector Slack to watch the 3 people most closely connected with that ruby. Its past, its present, and its future." She did not elaborate further. Inside her warm drawing room, Miss Marple sat by the fire for a long time without knitting. The Christmas decorations still hung in her own small tree, but they brought her no joy tonight. Somewhere out in the cold, Sylvia Reed, or Elsie Thompson, was either hiding in terror or lying dead. The ruby, broken from its setting, was in the hands of someone who believed it carried justice as well as blood, and the murderer, once a guest sing carols beneath the twinkling lights, was now watching and waiting for Miss Marple's next move. She spoke softly into the quiet room. "One cannot hide evil forever. The pattern always reveals itself in the end." Outside, the snow fell thicker than ever, covering the village in a fresh, deceptive blanket of purity. Chapter 10. The Weight of Truth. The next morning dawned grey and heavy, with snow still falling in thick, silent waves. St. Mary Mead had never felt so isolated. The roads were nearly impassable, and the village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next blow to fall. Miss Marple had spent much of the night awake, her mind turning over every scrap of evidence like a jeweller examining flawed stones. By 8 o'clock she was dressed and seated at her writing desk, making careful notes in her neat, old-fashioned handwriting. When Dr. Haydock arrived, stamping snow from his boots, he found her unusually pale but composed. "You look as if you haven't slept, Jane." "I have been thinking," she replied, "and I believe I am very close now. But before I speak to Inspector Slack, I need to be certain. Will you drive me to Gossington Hall?" The journey took nearly 40 minutes instead of the usual 10. When they finally reached the great house, they found it in a state of controlled chaos. Inspector Slack was shouting orders into the telephone. Peter Carmody sat on the stairs with his head in his hands. Simmons moved like a ghost, his face grey with worry. "Another note arrived this morning," Slack said without preamble, thrusting a piece of paper at Miss Marple, pushed under the front door before dawn. The message was short and written in the same spidery hand. "The ruby will be returned when the innocent is safe. One more life will be taken if anyone interferes. Justice must be complete." Miss Marple studied it for a long moment. "The killer is losing control," she said softly. "These notes are no longer clever, they are desperate." Peter looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "If Sylvia is still alive, we have to do what they say. I don't care about the ruby. I just want her back." Miss Marple turned to him with deep compassion. "My dear boy, I know you care for her, but we must be very careful. The murderer has already shown willingness to sacrifice others to protect themselves." She asked to be taken to the library once more. The room felt colder than ever. The Christmas tree was gone, but its ghost seemed to linger in the faint scent of pine, still clinging to the air. Miss Marple stood exactly where Geraldine Bantry had been found and slowly turned in a circle. "Geraldine came in here to check the presents," she murmured. She was alone for several minutes. Then someone followed her. Someone she knew well enough not to scream immediately. She moved to the tall mirror and adjusted it slightly. From her usual chair, she could see both doors. She saw her killer approaching, and yet she did not run. Dr. Haydock watched her closely. "You think she knew them too well to fear immediate violence?" "Exactly, until the moment the scarf went around her throat." At that moment, Miss Weatherby entered the library hesitantly. She had clearly not slept either. Jane, may I speak with you? Alone." The two ladies moved to the window seat. Miss Weatherby's voice was barely above a whisper. "I have remembered something else. On the night of the murder, when I was hiding, I saw the killer's hand for a brief second as they tore the brooch away. There was a small scar on the back of the hand, near the thumb, like an old burn mark." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Are you quite certain? I would swear to it." This was the final piece Miss Marple needed. She thanked Miss Weatherby gently and asked Dr. Haydock to fetch both Inspector Slack and Peter Carmody. When the men arrived, Miss Marple asked them all to sit. For the first time, she spoke with the full authority of her understanding. "I believe I now know most of what happened on Christmas Eve," she began quietly, "but I still do not know where Sylvia is. That is the most urgent matter." She turned to Peter. "You loved Sylvia, didn't you? Despite knowing she had been dishonest about her past." Peter nodded, his voice thick. "I knew. She told me everything 2 weeks ago. I didn't care. Aunt Geraldine was going to give her a chance. We were going to build a life together." Miss Marple nodded sadly. "That is why Sylvia became a threat. She knew too much." She turned to Inspector Slack. "The killer is someone who has carried hatred and resentment for many years. Someone who felt betrayed by Geraldine Bantry, not just recently, but long ago. The ruby was not stolen for money. It was taken as both punishment and symbol." At that moment, Simmons appeared at the door, looking deeply distressed. "Excuse me, but there is a visitor. She insists on seeing Miss Marple. She says her name is Priya Singh." The old Indian woman was shown in. She looked frailer than before, but her eyes burned with purpose. In her hands she carried a small wooden box. "I received this at my lodgings this morning," she said, with a note saying the time for justice had come. She opened the box. Inside, resting on faded silk, lay the magnificent Harrington ruby, the great square stone freed from its diamond setting. A collective gasp filled the room. Miss Marple took the box gently and examined the stone. "It has finally come home, Mrs. Singh." "But at what cost?" She turned to the others, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. "The murderer wanted the world to know the old wrong done to Ramesh Singh. They wanted Geraldine to suffer publicly for her husband's crime. But when Geraldine refused to make amends, the old resentment turned into something far more dangerous." Peter suddenly stepped forward. "Miss Marple, are you saying Miss Weatherby?" "No, my dear, not Miss Weatherby." Miss Marple looked toward the doorway, where Miss Weatherby had been standing moments earlier. She was no longer there. "Miss Weatherby has carried her bitterness quietly for decades," Miss Marple continued. "She was in love with Colonel Bantry many years ago. When he chose Geraldine and protected his friend's theft of the ruby, something inside her broke. She never forgave Geraldine for the life she believed was stolen from her. The recent argument with Sylvia gave her the perfect opportunity and scapegoat." Inspector Slack was already moving. "We need to find her immediately." But Miss Marple raised her hand. "There is more. I believe Sylvia's still alive. Miss Weatherby needs her as proof of her innocence, or as a final sacrifice if we press too hard." A search of the house began at once. Rooms were checked systematically. When they reached the old nursery on the top floor, they found the door locked from inside. After a brief struggle, the police broke it open. Sylvia Reed lay on the narrow bed, pale but alive. Her hands and feet were bound with silk scarves, and a gag had been placed in her mouth. Her eyes widened with relief when she saw them, as Dr. Haydock attended to her. Sylvia sobbed out her story. Miss Weatherby had lured her to the summer house with the note, then forced her at knife point back into the house through a side entrance only the family knew. She had kept her drugged and hidden for 2 days. She kept saying it was all Geraldine's fault, Sylvia whispered. That she had stolen everything, love, happiness, even justice. She said the ruby belonged to the past, and she was going to finish what should have been finished years ago. Miss Marple stood by the window, looking out at the falling snow. There was deep sadness in her eyes. The human heart, she reflected, could nurture the most terrible poisons. When love turned sour and opportunity never came. But even as relief spread through the house, one question remained. "Where is Miss Weatherby now?" Inspector Slack demanded. No one had an answer. Outside, fresh snow continued to fall, covering the footprints that led from the servants' entrance toward the woods behind Gossington Hall. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. "The final act is not yet over," she whispered. Chapter 11. The Broken Heart. The discovery of Sylvia Reed alive brought great relief, but Miss Weatherby had vanished. A search party was quickly formed. Fresh footprints led from the kitchen garden into the woods behind Gossington Hall. Miss Marple insisted on joining Dr. Haydock, Inspector Slack, and the others. The trail ended in a small clearing where an old stone seat stood beneath a large oak. Miss Weatherby was sitting there, motionless, snow settling on her shoulders. In her hand was Colonel Bantry's old revolver. "Stay back," she cried, her voice trembling. Miss Marple stepped forward alone, speaking gently. "Florence, my dear, it is over now. Put the gun down." Tears ran down Miss Weatherby's face. "I didn't plan to kill her, Jane. I only wanted her to admit the truth about the ruby and what her husband had done. But she laughed at me. She called me pathetic and jealous." Something inside me snapped. Her voice broke. "I used her own scarf. Afterwards, I took the ruby to make it look like an old revenge. I hid Sylvia because I needed someone to blame. I never wanted to hurt the girl. Only to save myself." Miss Marple's eyes were full of sadness. "All these years you carried such bitterness. It had destroyed you, Florence." "I loved Arthur," Miss Weatherby whispered. "Geraldine took everything from me. The life, the happiness, even the man I wanted. Wearing that ruby every Christmas was like a knife in my heart." She lowered the revolver. Inspector Slack moved forward and gently took it from her. Miss Weatherby offered no resistance, as the handcuffs were placed on her wrists. She looked small and broken. As they led her back through the snow, she turned to Miss Marple one last time. "Make sure the truth about Ramesh Singh is known. Don't let Geraldine's pride bury it again." "I promise," Miss Marple replied softly. Back at the hall, Sylvia was recovering by the fire. She told them how Miss Weatherby had lured her to the summer house and kept her drugged in the old nursery. Peter stayed close to her, relief and love clear on his face. Priya Singh held the returned ruby with quiet tears. Justice, though painful, had finally come. Miss Marple stood by the window, watching the snow fall. Her heart was heavy. She had solved the mystery, but the tragedy of a lonely, bitter heart weighed upon her. Chapter 12. The Light Returns. 3 days later, a quiet gathering was held at Gossington Hall. The snow was melting, and pale sunlight touched the windows. Those most affected by the tragedy had come together one final time. Miss Marple explained everything clearly. Miss Weatherby's long-hidden love for Colonel Bantry, her deep resentment toward Geraldine, and how small cruelties over decades had finally turned into murder. The ruby had not been taken for money, but as a symbol of old injustice. Peter Carmody held Sylvia's hand tightly. "We are going to London soon," he said. "A new life. We owe you everything, Miss Marple." Sylvia smiled gratefully. "You gave me a second chance. I won't waste it." Priya Singh announced that the ruby would be sold, and the money used to help others who had suffered. Major Allington apologised for keeping old secrets alive. Even Inspector Slack admitted that without Miss Marple, the truth might never have been known. A simple memorial service was held for Geraldine Bantry at the village church. Candlelight filled the old building, as the vicar spoke of forgiveness and new beginnings. That evening, Miss Marple sat peacefully by her own fireside. Dr. Haydock visited her with a glass of sherry. "You did it again, Jane," he said. "But at what cost?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The human heart can hold both great darkness and great light, Doctor. We must never stop noticing which one people choose." As the church bells rang in the new year, peace slowly returned to St. Mary Mead. Gossington Hall stood quietly under the winter sky, no longer haunted. In her small cottage, Miss Marple continued knitting, her wise eyes reflecting both sadness and quiet hope. Christmas had brought death and pain, but it had also brought truth, justice, and the promise of new beginnings. The village slept under a clear sky, and for the first time in many days, the lights of St. Mary Mead shone with genuine warmth once again.